Okay. My name's Mackenzie Murphy. Our project is on using goal setting and feedback to increase weekly running distances.
And I'm Jennifer Palmer.
I'm Hannah Seal.
I'm Mastine Tasnim.
And I'm Abby Winkowski.
The purpose of our study was to examine the effects of goal setting and performance feedback for increasing weekly running distance among female graduate students ages 22 through 31 with no known health conditions. As current graduate students and full-time employees working 7 to 10 hours per day, our group really found it difficult to find time to exercise. So we wanted to replicate a study that would focus on an opportunity for us to work on that. So according to a study conducted by Lee in 2014, most people prefer to do exercise through the form of running. Over 43 million Americans are running right now as their form of physical activity. And we wanted to also look into studies that incorporated manageable ways to track our progress with running. So we definitely wanted to find a study that incorporated smartphone technology. And then we wanted to find technology that incorporated some kind of goal setting. So Abby's going to talk a little bit more about how we narrowed down our study search.
So goal setting has been a common practice in the workplace since the 1960s. From there, it then transferred over to more in athletic performance. Goal setting itself can be done in many ways, and there's a lot of research on different ways that goal setting can be done and the effectiveness of those different types of ways to goal set. So we looked at goal setting interventions like self-reporting, using short-term goals, long-term goals, public posting, peer accountability, and then performance feedback. One of the studies we looked at was by Brost in 2002, and this examined how goals can be set and how effective public posting can be in goal setting. What public posting is and how they defined it in the study was that it's some way for all participants to view the results of the study and compare it to what their goals were. This study specifically worked with high school female athletes. The study concluded that goals should be established based on baseline results. In this study, what the coach did was the coach set a universal standard for all participants. But what they found was that if they used individual goals based on baseline data, that can be a more effective way to set the goals. They also said that public posting can be seen as a social reinforcer for goal achievement. Another study we looked at was by Maitland and Jervis. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but that was done in 2009, and it was done with youth soccer players. What this study did was the participants were asked to keep weekly journals and personal diaries, and then from that they set goals using those diaries, and they completed informal interviews with the researchers and the coaches. What they determined from that study was that the kids needed to be taught how to set goals and how to set specific measured, action-oriented, realistic, and timely goals, and otherwise known as SMART goals, which is a pretty common term, but that needs to be taught to kids. A lot of times when they were telling the kids how to set a goal, they were doing big aspirations like becoming a professional soccer player. But what they found was that those short-term goals that lead to more achievement than the long-term, like aspirational career goals. Finally, we looked at another study that compared charting the results of your goals versus not charting the results, and that was by Podcock, Foster, and McEwen in 2010. This was a study done with roller skating and youth that did roller skating. What they found was that charting itself did not lead to higher achievement in goal setting, but what did was the conversations that happened from charting it. So the coaches and the researchers would have conversations with the athletes regarding the charting the performance, and then the follow-up activities And the conversations that happened because of that really led to the achievement. So looking at all of that, it kind of led us to the study, which was using goal setting and feedback to increase weekly running distance. This study was published in 2014 by Wack, Crossland, and Miltenberger. So what this study focused on was short-term goal setting and then performance feedback. Performance feedback was defined as a weekly meeting with the researcher, and what they talked about was the last week's performances, and then as well as creating next week's goals. So this study concluded that, or the study found that all runners increased their weekly running distance as well as the length of a single running episode over the course of 20 weeks. And what it did was prove the effectiveness of combining short-term goal setting as well as performance feedback. Now Risha is going to go into the methods portion of the study in more detail in what this study had.
So the participants and settings of this study it's amongst 5 female graduate students aged 21 to 31 years with no health conditions reported. Running distance was based on the runner's preference, so we got to choose whether we wanted to run indoors, which would be a treadmill, or if we wanted to run outdoors, which included sidewalks, a running track, or a running path. No limitations were set on when to run or the time and place. It was completely up to the runner's preference. No difficulties or restrictions were found amongst the participants to take part in the study. So some of the materials that are required for the study were a smartphone for each participant, and with that smartphone, we had to download the application Map My Run, which would be used to track the distance of how far we would be running to help calculate the data. Optional materials were up to the runner's preference, what type of running shoes they wanted to use, if they wanted to wear workout attire, having a water bottle, headphones if they wanted to listen to music, and then a phone armband so that they could help carry their phone while they are running, depending on if they were to be running on a treadmill or if they'd be running outside. Behavior definition for the study is a running episode was defined as a continuous run at a speed faster than a brisk walk, which was considered to be 4 miles per hour. This did not include participants moving at a speed faster than a brisk walk to chase after an animal or child or when participating in a structured sporting event. So specifically over running a distance.
Thank you, Risha. We used a multiple baseline design with changing criterion across participants. So with the multiple baseline, we had multiple subjects that were using the same design all at once. And our design was, of course, the goal setting to increase our running. So in a multiple baseline, we applied the treatment to one participant while the others remained at baseline, and then continued this with all participants until they had all reached the intervention and were able to show experimental control. To show the experimental control, each participant's data had to have demonstrated change on the treatment which had been introduced. For the changing criterion aspect of this design, which we also were using, it meant that after participants finished baseline and moved into the intervention, we were using successive and gradual changes in the criteria. And although we weren't able to make it to a second criteria, in the study, the changes in the criteria were the steady increases of the goal setting. So that's what we would have done as well. And that would have been the short-term goals that we were setting to increase the criterion.
For baseline data collection, this took place before we developed any short or long-term goals or collaborated with the researcher to receive any feedback. During baseline, our participants utilized the Map My Run application on their phones to track their distance ran in miles. They did this by, you would press start my workout when you were about to start running, and then pause and finish when you were finished running to track the distance ran. This took place a minimum of 3 times, whether it was running outside or on a treadmill, and it lasted between 1 and 2 weeks for each of the participants. And Mackenzie is going to talk a little bit more now about the interventions that we had.
Intervention implementation was staggered across participants and began once baseline data was collected. Following baseline, each participant individually met virtually with the researcher via the GroupMe application to set their long-term distance goals. A long-term distance goal was a distance the participant wanted to run in a single running episode by the end of the study. During the intervention phase, participants met one time per week with their researcher prior to the intervention week beginning to set short-term goals as well. Short-term goals were defined as a distance the participant wanted to run in a single or daily running episode each week. And both long and short-term goals were based on the average running distance participants had during baseline. Participants were then expected to run a minimum of 3 times within a 7-day period. Every week, participants were expected to set a higher goal than the previous week, and they were required to have 2 out of the 3 runs per week at or above the criterion level. If a participant exceeded their short-term goal, they chose to either increase from their initial weekly goal or from the actual running distance. Weekly meetings via GroupMe application lasted no longer than 10 minutes and provided participants with not only the opportunity to set short-term goals, but to also receive visual performance feedback. Visual feedback included graphical displays of the participants' weekly running distance, whereas performance feedback consisted of a verbal description of the participant's progress provided by the researcher. Participants were required to upload their running data from the MapMyRun application prior to their scheduled weekly meeting with the researcher. MapMyRun housed all running episodes that could be viewed at any time by the participant or the researcher. Only 3 out of the 5 participants moved on to the intervention phase in this replication study. If participants failed to meet their daily running goal for the previous week, they had the option of remaining the same for a criterion level or lowering their short-term goal for the following week. Goals were lowered based on weekly running distance rather than daily running distance. None of the participants within this replication moved on to the second intervention phase.
So this was the form that we used to track data as well as communicate with the researcher. This is something that wasn't shown in the original study, but we wanted to develop something that would track all of our information since everyone was communicating in different states. Participants would record their individual distances from the MapMyRun application onto this Google Drive document that was then shared privately with their individual researcher. And researchers were notified via an automatic email when any information was added to the document. Participants recorded data after each running episode that occurred within the 7-day period, Sunday through Saturday. And at the end of that 7-day period, participants would total their mileage ran and compare it to the initial weekly goal. So that's what took place for the 3 participants who moved on to the intervention phase. And these were the goals that were set by the 3 participants who transitioned onto that intervention 1 phase. Goals were based on the average miles ran per running episode during their baseline. And there was a few different ways that we checked to assure that participants were following the intervention protocol when working towards these specific goals. So Mackenzie's gonna talk a little bit more about the IOA process.
The exact agreement measurement was used to assure inter-observer agreement. Screenshots were taken, saved, and shared with the researcher, noting each participant's run via the MapMyRun application. As you can see on the slide, that is an example of what a screenshot would look like. These screenshots were shared by uploading them onto the Google Doc that was previously described. 2 independent observers, the researcher and the participant, recorded the date and the distance per running episode. 100% of the participants' runs were reviewed by the researcher. In the original study, inter-observer agreement was done at 100%, but 97% was agreed upon. Results for IOA data of the replication study was at 100% for all group members across all phases.
To assure treatment integrity, the participants were regularly reminded by their researcher of the intervention protocols to make sure that they were running 3 times per week, that they were running inside or outside, and also reminded to collect their data through the MapMyRun application. Our researchers acted as reliability coaches and referred to a checklist to determine if treatment integrity was being met. So the questions that we looked at for those 3 participants who moved on to the intervention phase were their short-term goals set at the beginning of the week, meaning that they met with the researcher. We used the GroupMe application to communicate through a chat, text message chat. So we had to set goals prior to that Sunday. Did the participant run a minimum of 3 times within that intervention week? Did the participant run either outside or on a treadmill? Was the Map My Run application used to track the running episodes? And were 2 out of the 3 runs within the intervention week at or above the daily goal? So initially we said that we wanted 4 out of the 5 questions to be answered with a yes, meaning 80% accuracy. And then it was decided that treatment integrity had been met. For this study, the 3 participants that moved on to baseline only scored 60% due to running only 2 times or less during the intervention week and not being able to make 2 runs at or above their daily goal. We now are going to talk more about those actual results that came from that. 0 out of the 5 participants in this study increased their running distance or met their short-term goals. That was obtained because of a few different things that were changed from the original study that we replicated. We determined whether or not this helped us, unfortunately, not determine whether or not the intervention could be generalized. Several factors were different, including the length of time in which baseline and intervention phases took place. We also were using different data collection tools. And in addition, we modified our study due to the time length. And based on the results and how the participants' running distances were, we decided to discuss the increase per running episode rather than the weekly occurrences because we did not have that amount of time. And further explanation will then go on later regarding some limitations that we faced throughout the study. But right now we're going to go through each participant's actual data results.
Sorry. So my first run was on June 24th, and I ran 1.5 miles. My next one was on June 25th. I ran 0.78 miles. And then again on June 28th, I ran 0.82 miles. And then my final running episode was on June 29th, and it was 0.52 miles. My baseline mean was 0.905 miles. My baseline range was 0.52 to 1.5 miles.
So during baseline, I had 4 different running episodes. On 6/23, I ran 0.93 miles, 6/24, 0.89, 6/25, 0.85, and on 6/28, 1.13. During baseline, the average that I ran was 0.95 miles, and it ranged between 0.85 miles to 1.13 miles. I did see a difference in my running when I would sometimes run on the treadmill as well as outside. So I did both forms of the setting that was an option to the participants. So I do think that that may have affected some of my running. I also feel that the weather, sometimes I was running and it was 90-degree weather, and that affected the running as well. During the intervention phase, I ran on 2 different running episodes. On the first one, on 6/30, I ran 0.87 miles. And on the second one, on July 2nd, I ran 1.4 miles. So the average for the intervention phase was 1.13, and the average range was 0.87 to 1.4 miles. Unfortunately, I could not continue on at intervention 1, so I'm not sure if I would have moved on to intervention 2 or not at this time.
So for my running, I had 3 data points, 3 sessions at baseline. For my first baseline on the 24th, it was 0.78 miles. For my second run, it was on the 26th, and it was 1 mile. And on the 28th, it was 1.2 miles. So the baseline mean was 0.99 miles, and the range was 0.78 to 1.2 miles. And then I was able to move on to intervention, where I set a goal for 1 mile, and my first run was 0.89 miles, and my second run was 1 mile. This means that the intervention mean was 0.95 miles, and my intervention range was 0.89 to 1 mile. And I also was not able to continue on and finish that third session in the intervention phase, so I was not able to move on to the next phase of my intervention.
So I ran on 624 at baseline, 1 mile, and then on 625 at baseline I ran 1.2 miles, and then 626 at baseline I ran 2.23 miles. I was able to move at baseline mean. I was at 1.48, and then baseline range it was around 1 mile to 2.23 miles. And then I moved on to intervention on 7-1. I was able to run 1.33 miles. And then on 7-2, I was able to run 2.23 miles. My intervention mean was 1.78, and my intervention range was 1.33 to 2.23. The short-term goal for the initial intervention phase was for me to run 1.5 miles per running episode. I was also unable to move on to the second intervention phase due to the fact that I only had 2 data points. I noticed that I was able to run greater distance when I had my headphones with me, and then the days that I forgot my headphones, I was only able to run a shorter amount of distance.
So I remained in baseline for the entirety of our study. So on 622, I ran 1 mile. On 624, I ran 0.181 miles. On 627, I ran 1 mile. And 629, I ran 1 mile. So my range was 0.81 to 1 mile, and my average was 0.9 miles for baseline.
So there were several limitations that we noticed while replicating this study. Our research group first found that in the original research study, each participant used a Nike plus sport kit and a Nike sport band that each participant had, and that was equipped with a sensor to track their distance. So in the original study, their running equipment estimated 90 to 100% accuracy after it was calibrated to each participant. And then as a group, we were unable to obtain the Nike sport kit and sport band for each participant. So instead, we utilized the smartphone app, which had been mentioned. It was called Map My Run. Because we used the Map My Run instead of the Nike sport kit, it tracked distance a little bit differently. It used GPS technology on a phone rather than a calibration sensor. So that accuracy is not going to be the same as what was used in the original study, which could potentially cause a little bit of a limitation there. Another one of our main limitations that we had noted in our replication was the time. So in the original study, the entire project lasted for 20 weeks. Baseline data lasted between 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the participant, and then intervention data started at different weeks for each participant, but it actually included 2 intervention phases that lasted up to 16 weeks. The first intervention phase in the original study consisted of daily goal setting, and then the second intervention phase was implemented and it consisted of weekly goal setting. So due to our shortened time frame to conduct this replication, we were unable to replicate that aspect of the original study. So instead, we were only able to have our baseline data last 1 week, and only 3 participants were able to progress into the intervention phase. And because short-term goals were meant to be made after the completion of baseline data, only 2 of our participants were not able to meet the short-term goals. And then the participants that progressed to intervention only had time to do 1 phase of the intervention rather than 2 different phases. Additionally, another limitation that occurred in regards to the research was in regards to the researcher role in this study. In the original study, there was 1 single researcher, and that person met with all of the participants and discussed all of the long-term and short-term goals across everyone. That researcher was not a participant, so that person was able to solely focus on the researcher role. And that person also collected data for all of the participants individually and was the one that conducted the IOA data. And because of our group requirements that required each member to be a participant in the study, we did not have a person to fill the participant role. So instead, each member of our group filled the role as the researcher for another member of the group, and that way we could have each person be a researcher and a participant. This could potentially have changed the social aspect of running just by knowing that you would be turning in or reporting your runs and your research to a group member who is also running. And of course, that could be a potential positive aspect just by the social aspect of knowing that your friend or your coworker or colleague would understand and know how much you ran. But that could be a potential limitation.
So the purpose of our replication study was to see if we could replicate the results of the study using goal setting and feedback to increase running distance. Unfortunately, due to the limitations that we had, we were not able to make that same conclusion. So we cannot say that there was a clear functional relationship between the distance running and the goal setting and performance feedback. Because of the limited time in the intervention phase, we were not able to see the same results that this study did. If further research was done, looking at the Map My Run application and seeing the effectiveness of that application and the accuracy of that application, we may be able to draw the same conclusions. Also, if there was extended time in the intervention phase, we may have been able to draw that conclusion. Based on the other research regarding goal setting and performance feedback, we hypothesized that distance would increase when goal setting was in place, and we as a group think that we could replicate the results if we were able to have that same amount of time. So that is the next looks at some of our references in the studies that we looked at, but that is all we have for you today.